Hello there, welcome to Skanky Productions. I'm Karen Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if Russia became Catholic? Now we're not going to cover much of the history in this, so I'd highly recommend that you watch our previous video on what if Russia became Muslim. Definitely go and check that video out because we're not going to cover the history in this, so watch that for more information. But what we will do is have this video split into 3 different parts. So we're going to have, first of all, the effects that this would have had on Russia. Next, we're going to have the effects that it would have had on Russia's near abroad. And then finally, we're going to have the effects that this would have had on the wider world. So if you like the sound of that, then don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out our many other videos on this channel. I promise that you will not be disappointed. And also don't forget to subscribe to our second channel, which is SKP Film. For that, we have covered lots of different films to do with Disney at the moment, but in the future we'll be looking at Kubrick, we'll be looking at Chaplin, we'll be looking at all the greats, right? So definitely subscribe to that and stay tuned for many videos to come with that. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into this scenario, so buckle up and let's go for the ride. So the very first thing that we should say with regard to this is, this would never have happened. So like we always say in our videos, this would never have happened. Because at the end of the day, the reason why this would never have happened is because the schism between the Catholic world and the Orthodox world took place in 1054 AD, and Russia Christianized in 988 AD. So if they had wanted to become Catholic or wanted to stay Catholic, they could easily have done that. Because it's actually technically not fair to even say that Russia became Orthodox, because obviously until the Great Schism there was no Orthodox Church. So in this scenario here, we have to kind of imagine that when there ended up being this Great Schism, the Russians decided to stay with the rest of Europe and remain as Catholic basically, as opposed to following that of Byzantium. However, this wouldn't have happened, and the reason why Russia followed the example of the Byzantine Empire is because that was where they got their inspiration from to have their churches. This is where they did a lot of their trade. This is where they had a lot of their foreign relations. And so they followed Byzantium because they saw Byzantium as the second Rome. And then later Russians, saw Moscow as the third Rome. So this tie in with like Byzantium, this is the main reason why they didn't do any of this stuff, right? So we have to talk about Russia being Catholic and how this would have, changed Russia itself. So the main thing to say is that there would basically be no distinction in our minds or in the Russians' minds as, the difference between the West and between the Orthodox world. So the Orthodox world in our own timeline is basically the Balkans and Russia. Whereas the West is pretty much anywhere which had the historical link of being run by the Catholic Church in Rome. So whether this is the Protestant world or the Catholic world, this is essentially what we think of as the West. So in this timeline here, Russia would very much be part of the West. And one of the main distinctions that kind of kept them separate from the rest of Europe was partly to do with the different religions. And also we should say that, actually, first of all, before I kind of explain this, big shout out to whatifalthist. His channel is absolutely brilliant. Definitely go and check that out. And his videos explaining different civilizations, it was very helpful in this bit. So the Orthodox world, in comparison to the Western world, it had much more of a system whereby, you had the state, and then below that you had the church. So the church was always subservient to the interests of the ruling elite, in particular that of the Tsar or any kind of emperor that they had at the top of that system. Whereas in the West, you had an adversarial relationship between the state and the church. So at certain points and in certain places, you had where the church was more powerful than the state. In other places, you had it where the state was more powerful than the church. And in some places, it was a separation of church and state. In other places, there was the merging of church and state. And so this is a major thing which has a long-term impact on what separated the West from the East. So in the East, right, in the Orthodox world, the state is the center of that civilization. Whereas in the West, there was competing factions. So you had, the nobility, you had monarchy and stuff, you had the church, you had merchants, you had many different people who were competing for power and influence within that state. Whereas in the East, everything is very top down, it's very authoritarian. And this means that the kind of civilization which comes out of that is one in which people are used to be governed by one absolute ruler, as opposed to there being a dispersal of power and therefore competing interests. So the main thing that would have separated the East from the West is, I think in this timeline here, Russia arguably would have been more pluralistic and therefore in a later stage more democratic, and would have followed more of the example of many of the other places in Europe than was otherwise the timeline. And I should also say that I don't think that the Protestant Reformation, which took place in the 16th century, would have spread to Russia. The main reason for this is because the Protestant world was primarily from different places which had a Germanic language. So whether this is Germany, whether this is England, whether this is Scandinavian countries, it's a thing where this is where Protestantism tended to flourish, with very few exceptions. And therefore, I think that if Russia had become Catholic in this timeline, it most likely would have stayed Catholic, much in the same way as you had in the situation with Poland. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the beginning was tolerant towards the Protestants, but when you end up having a few Protestant noblemen who tried to overthrow the state, that's when they clamped down on it, and that's when they became very intolerant towards Protestantism. And so I think that Russia probably would have followed the exact example of Poland, where they would have tolerated it up to a point, but as soon as it ended up conflicting with the interests of the Catholic state, this is where there would have been a crackdown, basically. And so with that, that covers the first chapter of this, which is looking at the effects on Russia. I would say also that in terms of, where I looked at the video of Russia becoming Muslim, a big part of that I focused on alcoholism. However, I should say this, there's plenty of Catholic countries which engage in alcoholism, whether it's Ireland, whether it's Poland, etc., etc. And so I think that them being Catholic wouldn't have actually changed much in the way of, how the society in Russia is. Maybe there would have been less so or more so. There's no way of really telling that. So I don't think it's as big of a factor as it was in the previous video looking at if Russia became Muslim. So now we have to talk about the effects that this would have had on Russia's near abroad. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term near abroad, this is essentially all the countries which are, that Russia would like to have in its sphere of influence. So these are typically countries which border Russia or go just beyond that border. And this is basically the places that they want to have a lot of control over. Now, a big part of the geopolitics of the 19th century, especially the later 19th century, was this thing of Russia trying to expand in the Balkans against the Ottoman Turks. And a big reason why they were stopped multiple times is because Britain and France didn't want Russia to expand into the Mediterranean and to threaten the Ottoman Empire. And so you can see this in the Crimean War. Definitely go and check out the video which we did on that many years ago. That's very, very useful and it's got lots of information. And then also you end up having the Treaty of Berlin from 1878, which again frustrated Russia's imperial ambitions there. So if Russia had just been another Catholic country, then first of all, Russia probably, maybe for geopolitical reasons, they would have expanded there. But a big part of why they were pushing there in the first place was to do with religion, was to do with the fact that they wanted to liberate Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, from the Muslim Turks. And this was a big driving factor in why they did this. However, if they were Catholic, would there have been the same drive? Not so much. There would have been perhaps a geopolitical reason for them doing this, but there wouldn't have been the same religious reason for them doing it. And therefore, Russia, which had always been seen as a kind of protector of the Orthodox people within the Balkans, this wouldn't have really been the running narrative, and therefore things there would have arguably changed quite a lot. So I think the most notable thing to kind of say within this is that the Orthodox world would be pretty much just restricted to the Balkans and certain places within the Caucasus. So if you look, for instance, at Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia, and Armenia, these places here, I still think would still have been Orthodox. However, it's very, very limited. To give you an idea of this, there's just 220 million adherents of Orthodox religion in the world. And actually, I found something out from doing research for this. The Coptic Christians in Egypt and also the Ethiopian church. They are not seen as Eastern Orthodox. I don't fully understand why, but that's just something quite interesting to note. So basically, the Orthodox world would be restricted pretty much just to these kind of places. And so, would the Crimean War have happened? Would there have been the great game between Russia and the Western powers in the 19th century? Arguably not, but at the same time, it still was the clash of different empires. And we should also say as well that a big part of Polish resistance to Russia was because Russia was trying to obviously Russify the Poles. And a big part of what they were trying to do with this Russification was converting the Poles from being Catholic to being Orthodox. Now, this obviously didn't end up actually being successful. However, if Russia had also been Catholic, the resistance of the Poles against the Russians would have been much less so in this time, because it wouldn't have felt like such an imposition on them. We should also say as well with regard to the Cyrillic alphabet. Cyrillic alphabet is primarily used by places within the Orthodox world, whereas in the West it tends to be more the Latin alphabet. So what I think with this, I think that there's a high likelihood of Russia adopting the Latin text, which again would have made any difference between Polish and Russian much less so in like the centuries that were to come. And now finally, we should be talking about the effects on the wider world. So first of all, I would make the argument that there's a good chance that World War I wouldn't have happened to the same extent that it did in our own timeline. The reason being is because, yes, of course, Pan-Slavism was a big thing, so the Russian emperor was seen as the defender of the Slavic people, but we also have to bear in mind that, of course, Serbia, which ended up being attacked by Austro-Hungary because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, it was a thing where Russia also felt like it needed to defend Serbia because, it had the same Orthodox faith. And therefore, Russia came to Serbia's aid because of that. So they weren't really that concerned about Slavs because if you think about it, the German Empire had many Slavs and so did the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So if they were just motivated purely by Pan-Slavism, then they would have been concerned about all these other places where the Germanic people had control over the Slavs. The main thing was to do with orthodoxy. And actually you can see that the main difference between Croatia and Serbia, even though their language is pretty much identical, is the fact that, the Croats, it's in Latin text, and that's because they're Catholic, and the Serbs, they are, of course, Eastern Orthodox, and that's why they have the Cyrillic text. There's an extra level to which the Russians would have felt like they were defending of a fellow brother nation, as opposed to if they were just Catholic, they probably would be like, okay, cool, the Catholic Empire is invading, an Orthodox state. Do we really care? Probably not. So I think that World War I might not have happened to the same extent that it did otherwise. And I think also that if there's no World War I, then the Tsar wouldn't have been overthrown. But also arguably, if the Tsar had a more pluralistic, democratic Western society, it's much more unlikely that revolution would have actually happened. And therefore, it would have been much less likely that communism would have arisen. Because it didn't arise in Germany, it didn't arise in Austria, it didn't arise in any other place in Europe. It only arose in Russia, where you already had this very top-down system where everything was very centralized, right? And we've covered that more in our video of what if the Russian Revolution never happened. Definitely go and check that video out. Because our entire society, both from the state and from even big business, was incredibly top-down. And so if there was more pluralism, then arguably there would have been no communism, and therefore, if there was no communism in Russia, it would never have spread to the wider world. And so the 20th century would have been completely different, and arguably the 21st century would be even more different, because Russia would not be seen as having an extra layer of it being an outsider, and it would have been much more in keeping with Western traditions and with Western customs and with Western governance. And therefore, what we're seeing at the moment with Putin, who is basically a modern day Tsar, where, as you can see, the church is very much defending that regime. And actually, definitely go and check out this channel as well. Absolutely love it. It's very, very informative. Definitely need to subscribe to them because you will learn so much more about the Orthodox religion if you didn't already. So, what I would say to this is the world would be very, very different, and arguably, depending on what perspective you have, the world would arguably been a better place if Russia had decided that it was going to be a Catholic country. So with that, we have to conclude the video here, but obviously if you liked it, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be, what if the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had survived? So this channel here has kind of ignored a lot of Polish history thus far, and so we're going to make up for it by going in depth in Polish history, and with particular emphasis on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and also the long-lasting effects that it had. So that being said, have a great day and bye.